What is this book? Bertrand Russell, History of Western Philosophy, and its connection with political and social circumstances from the earliest times to the present day. Preface. A few words of apology and explanation are called for if this book is to escape even more severe censure than it doubtless deserves. Apology is due to the specialists on various schools and individual philosophers. With the possible exception of Leibniz, every philosopher of whom I treat is better known to some others than to me. If, however, books covering a wide field are to be written at all, it is inevitable, since we are not immortal, that those who write such books should spend less time on any one part than can be spent by a man who concentrates on a single author or a brief period. Some whose scholarly austerity is unbending will conclude that books covering a wide field should not be written at all, or if written, should consist of monographs by a multitude of authors. There is, however, something lost when many authors cooperate. If there is any unity in the movement of history, if there is any intimate relation between what goes before and what comes later, it is necessary for setting this forth that earlier and later periods should be synthesized in a single mind. The student of Rousseau may have difficulty in doing justice to his connection with the Sparta of Plato and Plutarch. The historian of Sparta may not be prophetically conscious of Hobbes and Fichte and Lenin. To bring out such relations is one of the purposes of this book, and it is a purpose which only a wide survey can fulfill. There are many histories of philosophy, but none of them, so far as I know, has quite the purpose that I have set myself. Philosophers are both effects and causes. Effects of their social circumstances and of the politics and institutions of their time, causes, if they are fortunate, of beliefs which mold the politics and institutions of later ages. In most histories of philosophy, each philosopher appears as in a vacuum. His opinions are set forth unrelated except, at most, to those of earlier philosophers. I have tried, on the contrary, to exhibit each philosopher, as far as truth permits, as an outcome of his milieu, a man in whom were crystallized and concentrated thoughts and feelings which, in a vague and diffused form, were common to the community of which he was a part. This has required the insertion of certain chapters of purely social history. No one can understand the Stoics and Epicureans without some knowledge of the Hellenistic age, or the Scholastics without a modicum of understanding of the growth of the Church from the 5th to the 13th centuries. I have therefore set forth briefly those parts of the main historical outlines that seem to me to have had most influence on philosophical thought, and I have done this with most fullness where the history may be expected to be unfamiliar to some readers. For example, in regard to the early Middle Ages, but in these historical chapters, I have rigidly excluded whatever seemed to have little or no bearing on contemporary or subsequent philosophy. The problem of selection in such a book as the present is very difficult. Without detail, a book becomes jejune and uninteresting. With detail, it is in danger of becoming intolerably lengthy. I have sought a compromise by treating only those philosophers who seem to me to have considerable importance, and mentioning, in connection with them, such details as, even if not of fundamental importance, have value on account of some illustrative or vivifying quality. Philosophy, from the earliest times, has been not merely an affair of the schools or of disputed competition between a handful of learned men. It has been an integral part of the life of the community, and as such, I have tried to consider it. If there is any merit in this book, it is from this point of view that it is derived. This book owes its existence to Dr. Albert C. Barnes, having been originally designed and partly delivered as lectures at the Burns Foundation in Pennsylvania. As in most of my work during the years since 1932, I have been greatly assisted in research and in many other ways by my wife, Patricia Russell. Okay. Uh, Chapter 1, General Characteristics. The period of history which is commonly called modern, has a mental outlook which differs from that of the medieval period in many ways. Of these, two are the most important: the diminishing authority of the church and the increasing authority of science. With these two, others are connected. The culture of modern times is more lay than clerical. States increasingly replace the the church as the governmental authority that controls culture. Government. The government of The government of nations is at first mainly in the hands of kings. Then, as in ancient Greece, the kings are gradually replaced by democracies or tyrants. The power of the national state and the functions that it performs grow steadily throughout the whole period, apart from some minor fluctuations. But at most times, the state has less influence on the opinions of philosophers than the church had in the Middle Ages. The feudal aristocracy, which north of the Alps had been able till the 15th century to hold its own against central governments, loses first its political and then its economic importance. It is replaced by the king in alliance with rich merchants. These two share power in different proportions in different countries. Ha ha ha. In different proportions in different countries, there is a tendency for the rich merchants to become absorbed into the aristocracy from the time of the American and French revolutions onwards. Democracy, in the modern sense, becomes an important political force. Socialism, as opposed to democracy based on private property, first acquires governmental power in 1917. This form of government, however, if it spreads, must obviously bring with it a new form of culture. The culture with which we shall be concerned is in the main liberal, that is to say, of the kind most naturally associated with commerce. To this, there are important exceptions, especially in Germany. Fichte and Hegel, to take two examples, have an outlook which is totally unconnected with commerce, but such exceptions are not typical of their age. The rejection of ecclesiastical authority, which is the negative characteristics of the modern age, begins earlier than the positive characteristic, which is the acceptance of scientific authority. In the Italian Renaissance, science played a very small part. The opposition to the church in men's thoughts was connected with antiquity and looked still to the past, but to a more distant past than that of the early church and the Middle Ages. The first serious eruption of science was the publication of the Copernican theory in 1543, but this theory did not become influential until it was taken up and improved by Kepler and Galileo in the 17th century. Then began the long fight between science and dogma, in which traditionalists fought a losing battle against new knowledge. The authority of science, which is recognized by most philosophers of the modern epoch, is a very different thing from the authority of the church. Since it is intellectual, not governmental, no penalties fall upon those who reject it. No prudential arguments influence those who accept it. It prevails solely by its intrinsic appeal to reason. It is, moreover, a piecemeal and partial authority. It does not, like the body of Catholic dogma, lay down a complete system covering human morality, human hopes, and the past and future history of the universe. It pronounces only on whatever at the time appears to have been scientifically ascertained, which is a small island in an ocean of science. There is yet another difference from ecclesiastical authority, which declares its pronouncements to be absolutely certain and eternally unalterable. The pronouncements of science are made tentatively on a basis of probability and are regarded as liable to modification. This produces a temper of mind very different from that of the medieval dogmatists. So far, I have been speaking of theoretical science, which is an attempt to understand the world. Practical science, which is an attempt to change the world, has been important from the first and has continually increased in importance until it has almost ousted theoretical science from the start. The practical importance of science was first recognized in connection with where Galileo and Leonardo obtained government employment by their claim to improve artillery and the art of fortification. From their time onwards, the part of the men of science in war has steadily grown greater. Their part in developing machine production and accustoming the population to the use first of steam, then of electricity came later and did not begin to have important political effects until near the end of the 19th century. The triumph of science has been mainly due to its practical utility, and there has been an attempt to divorce this aspect from that of theory, thus making science more and more technique and less a doctrine as to the nature of the world. The penetration of this point of view to the philosophers is very recent. Emancipation from the authority of the church led to the growth of individualism, even to the point of anarchy. Discipline, intellectual, moral, and political, was stated in the minds of the men of the Renaissance with the scholastic philosophy and ecclesiastical government. The Aristotelian logic of the schoolman was narrow, but afforded a training in a certain kind of accuracy. When the school of logic became unfashionable, it was not at first succeeded by something better, but only by an electric imitation of ancient models. Until the 17th century, there was nothing of importance in philosophy, the moral and political anarchy of 15th century Italy was appalling and gave rise to the doctrines of Machiavelli. At the same time, the freedom from mental shackles led to an astonishing display of genius in art and literature. But the society is unstable. The Reformation and the Counter Reformation, combined with the subjection of Italy to Spain, put an end to both the good and the bad of the Italian Renaissance. When the movement spread north of the Alps, it had not the same anarchic character. Modern philosophy, however, has retained for the most part an individualistic and subjective tendency. This is very marked in Descartes, who builds up on knowledge from the certainty of his own existence and accepts clearness and distinctness, both subjective as criteria of truth. It is not prominent in Spinoza but reappears in Leibniz's windowless monarchs. Locke, whose temperament is thoroughly objective, is forced reluctantly into the subjective doctrine that knowledge is of the agreement or disagreement of ideas, a view so repulsive to him that he escapes from it by violent inconsistencies. Berkeley, after abolishing matter, which is only saved from complete subjectivism by a use of God which most subsequent philosophers have regarded as illegitimate, in me or him. The empiricist philosophy culminated in a skepticism which none could refute and none could accept. Kant and Fichte were subjective in temperament as well as in doctrine. Hegel saved himself by means of the influence of Spinoza. Rousseau and the Romantic movement expanded subjectivity from theory of knowledge to ethics and politics and ended logically in complete anarchism such as that of Bakunin. This extreme of subjectivism is a form of madness. Meanwhile, science as technique was building up in practical man a quite different outlook from any that was to be found among theoretical philosophers. Technique conferred a sense of power. Man is now so much less at the mercy of his environment than he was in former times. But the power conferred by technique is social and not individual. An average individual wrecked on a desert island could have achieved more in the 17th century than he could now. Scientific technique requires the cooperation of a large number of individuals organized under a single direction. Its tendency, therefore, is against anarchism and even individualism, since it demands a well knit social structure. Unlike religion, it is ethically neutral. It assures men that they can perform wonders but does not tell them what wonders to perform. In this way, it is incomplete. In practice, the purposes to which scientific skill will be depend largely on chance. The man at the head of the vast organizations which it necessitates can, within limits, turn said this way or that as they please. The power impulse thus has a scope which it never had before. The philosophies that have been inspired by scientific technique are power philosophies and tend to regard everything non-human as mere raw material. Ends are no longer considered, only the skillfulness of the process is valued. This is also is a form of madness. It is in our day the most dangerous form and the one against which a sane philosophy should provide an antidote. The ancient world found an end to anarchy in the Roman Empire, but the Roman Empire was a brute fact, not an ideal. The Catholic world sought an end to anarchy in the church, which was an idea but was never adequately embodied in fact. Neither the ancient nor the medieval solution was satisfactory. The one because it could not be idealized, the other because it could not be actualized. The modern world at present seems to be moving towards a solution like that of antiquity, a social order imposed by force representing the will of the powerful rather than the hopes of common men. The problem of a durable and satisfactory social order can only be solved by combining the solidity of the Roman Empire with the idealism of Saint Augustine's city of God. To achieve this, a new philosophy will be needed. Oh my God. Chapter 2, The Italian Renaissance. The modern as opposed to the medieval outlook began in Italy.